Hello, this video is hopefully going to help you write the body of your paper, and much like the introduction, you are not reinventing the wheel. Nobody is expecting you to come up with a way to make an argument that's never been done before. That's crazy. We have been talking, arguing, persuading, informing for thousands of years, and we've got some systems that work. So I am going to walk you through the handout that I have that has some blank spots so you can actually put your ideas there. And then I think if you go through the handout, you will be able to jump into the body of your paper. So let's go to the handout. Now, this is linked on our homepage, and some basics. A body paragraph, right? Number one, it's going to have a topic sentence, which is actually down here. And a topic sentence is that main idea of the paragraph. It is like a thesis for the paragraph. So the topic sentence is the main idea of the paragraph, and it's either in the beginning, hey, I'm going to tell you about this, or it's at the end, summarizing everything that you did. And what your topic sentence does is help us guide us along and say, oh, that's what this paragraph is about. Oh, that's if it's in the beginning, or if we get to the end, a nice summary. So each paragraph should have a topic sentence at the beginning or the end, and that should relate to your thesis. And that's how you know your paper's tied together. Because if you can highlight your thesis and then highlight each topic sentence of the body paragraphs and see that they're connected, then you know that your paper is connected. If you have a topic sentence that does not seem related to the thesis, then you know either that paragraph has to go or the thesis needs to be adjusted so it will include that paragraph. The other thing is topic sentences go at the beginning or the end, not in the middle. If it's put in the middle, it really is confusing for the reader and it looks muddled and we don't know what your main point is. So beginning or end, each body paragraph should have one. There also should be transitions, both between paragraphs and sometimes content inside the paragraphs. Not sometimes, practically always, right? Because your job is to lead us through in a way that makes sense. And that's everything from first, second, and third to furthermore, however, all of these different words that we use to let us know what the connection is between to the next thought. So that's your body paragraph. Just in general what that is. It's different from your introductory paragraph or concluding paragraph because it has a different job. Introduction sets the stage. Body is what your argument is, what you are saying. And then the conclusion wraps things up. So in the middle, what are you going to do? Well, there's 7 main types of paragraphs. But before we get there, I want to mention too, pretty much any technique that can use for an introduction, you can use that in a body paragraph. For example, you might at the start of a paragraph ask a question and then begin to answer it, and by the time you get to the end of that paragraph, you have your nice answer, which would be the topic sentence, right? Because it's that main idea, and you used a question, right? Actually, as your transition to get in there, right? Or you might tell a story, or you may use quotes. So all of the techniques that you could use to start a paper could be modified and end up in a body paragraph. Now, as far as like the big categories go, and this is what the handout hopefully printed out, and check out this handout. So there's compare and contrast, right? And the 2 main ways to do compare and contrast is you could say all the similarities, right, between the 2 objects, and then all the differences, right? That's kind of like all A's, then all B's. Or you can break it down into categories. So you say, if we're going about animals, you could do giraffes and tigers. A, height. So you just put the height of both, right? Giraffe this, tiger's that. B, number of legs. Giraffe this, tiger that. C, so you can group it either way that you want. Now, I'm going to use post-traumatic stress syndrome, right, PTSD, because it comes up in the stories that we're reading, just to give you a couple examples. So if you wanted to use compare and contrast, right, you could compare and contrast 2 different people, maybe somebody who shows symptoms and somebody doesn't, right? You could compare, so you could think about what is it about PTSD and explaining that to my audience. Would it be helpful if I compared it? So maybe you're talking about the different types of trauma that can cause it, right? Different traumas, and you can say how the traumas are different, but here's the similarities. So comparing and contrasting can be a way to get us to see whatever it is that you're writing about. I'm making a circle in a bigger picture by you comparing it, contrasting it to something else. Where there's space here, what I want you to do is print this out. And then as you're going through it, think to yourself, oh man, whatever my topic is, what things could I compare and contrast, and go ahead and make some notes. We're going to worry about order later, right? Because every paper will probably require a different order. So go through, think to yourself, what could I compare and contrast? Make some notes here, right? Narrative, right? Narration, it tells a story. Is there a story that would really help us understand what it is that you're talking about, right? And in this case too, you won't just want to tell us the story and then we have to figure it out. You want to tell the story and give us some explanation about why it's important or what we should be getting from the story. Which makes this a good point to talk about how while we break this stuff into categories, that doesn't mean the categories cannot blend together. In fact, often they will. Here's one of those things about context, right? In order to present a lecture, I have to break things into categories. Well, I don't have to, but if I do, it's easier to digest, even if the categories, right, have some flaws in them. So that's the trade-off. I put it into these 7 types, right, but they blend. So as you're making your notes, you might even realize, wow, well, I have to tell my story to compare and contrast. So you blend those 2 types of paragraphs. So here, right, think about, this is definitely a spot where, hey, since our paper has to be connected to the stories, it's not about the stories, it's what the story shows us. Hey, which short story in the story that we read, or what element of, hey, you know what, I really need to talk about this part where there was the little girl who was safe next to this pretty house, and that's for whatever reason that's important. So make a note, hey, that's the story I need to tell. Or in your research, you may have read about other stories, put that down. Here are some stories that may help make my point. As you're filling out this handout, more is better. Maybe you write down 4 different stories that would be valuable for it. Maybe you write down 5 different things you can compare and contrast. And then, as you start putting your paper together, you realize, you know what are my top 2? Or what's the top 1? So as you go through this, fill it out with as many ideas as you can, and then at the end, you can go back and circle your best stuff and get going on your draft. So, a process paragraph, right? This is how do you do something, how something works. So it's funny, if you've ever taken a language class, you've probably had to be tested on, tell somebody a process, like how to cook eggs, right? So then you say, okay, you got to take the eggs out, you crack the eggs, you turn on the stove. So process is how something happens from start to finish. So if you were taking PTSD, and we'll get to definitions later, but you'll say, what happens? You might look at, first there's an event, right? Then you can look at, what happens to the physically, to the brain, to the body, what happens in the moment, what happens a day later, what happens a week later, and, go through the process of what this looks like, right? Now, analysis is a little bit different than process. A process is from start to finish, typically, right? Where analysis means to break something apart. So if you're going to write about post-traumatic stress syndrome, you might break it down into, here are the physical components, right? The brain chemistry that changes, the heart rate, etc. Here's the physical, right? Here's the mental, the thought process or the neurology that's going on, and here is the physical. I'm trying to remember if I just repeated myself. But anyways, analysis, you break things into its parts. So start to finish doesn't matter. The order isn't important. Maybe I want to talk about right now everything that's going on physically, right, in the brain, right? And so that could be one part of it. And then I could talk about how that shows up in the body as another part. And the idea with analysis is sometimes it's really helpful to break something apart to see how it works. A typical example is you think about a car engine. For a lot of us, you look at a car engine and it's just a big block of metal, right? But if you break down the parts and say, hey, here's the carburetor, I'm old. So here's where the carburetor used to be. But if you can break it into its parts, then you can see, oh, this is how it works. So think about whatever your topic is, and are there things, or how would you break your topic into parts? And you might not even use this necessarily into a paragraph, but it's definitely worth thinking about before you even start your paper. Getting into that body is, okay, if I'm writing about how X does this, right? Well, what are the parts of X? And when you break something down, think micro and macro. So if you're going to break something down, so think about if you're talking about people, break it down to the individual and say, okay, what are the parts of the individual? But then also go big. So because an individual, we aren't just individuals, right? We are connected to a society. What are the pieces of the society, right, that support what we're doing, that get in the way of what we're doing, that don't care what we're doing? So analysis can be very big or small, and think about both when you're deciding about how you're going to explain your idea. Definition, right? This is one of those techniques you could use as an introduction, but maybe you didn't want to. You set the stage, we got a nice idea of what's going on. Now you get into the body, and there might be a term that you need to define. Go ahead and make sure we know, right? Because if you're using a term, right, that either your typical college student won't know, you need to define it. Or if you're using a term that is defined in many ways, so you might be bringing in confusion in your paper, you need to say, here's the definition I'm using. All right. Now, the persuasive paragraph, and you can see how if you're going to persuade somebody, you'll probably have some comparison contrast. You might have definition. There's really all of these blend together. But when you think about persuasion, which you are really not being asked to do in this paper, consider this one. This is really informative. You're doing research, putting your thoughts together with what you think, what you've learned, and presenting it to us. But there are times when, okay, I want to make sure people understand something this way, or I want to persuade you that this is the right interpretation. When you can think about when you're going to persuade, there's multiple ways to do it, right? There's those emotional appeals, right, that makes us brings up feeling, right? There's the logical and reasoning, right? Ethos, pathos, and logos, right? So ethos it's ethics, but it's also credibility of the writer. Really, it's kind of more on that side. And you show us that you're credible by using good resources, by being honest in the way that you present things, right? Pathos is feeling. Think about, I always bring up this in class. In California, when they're trying to legalize, actually just was for the medical, they had a bunch of parents with cancer saying, hey, after chemo, I have no energy, I can't be a parent. I smoke marijuana, I get my appetite back, and I can be a mom, I can be a dad. Who's going to argue that? That was a very strong, right, emotional appeal, which hit more chords than the emotional appeal of, oh no, pot, everybody's going to go and turn into a rapist or whatever, add your racist history to this thing. So, and I'm not advocating for pot. But there's also some crazy stuff which maybe will come up later in context. Because if you look at some of the biggest players as far as legalizing marijuana, it's the pharmaceutical companies and the prison industrial complex. Is it really an industrial complex? Well, private prisons like laws that lock up a lot of people. And that makes sense. But I digress. So persuasion, you may have parts, but in this paper, remember, I really want you to inform me. You're not trying to convince of anything, though. If you make a good argument, there's going to be an element of persuasion, but not so much as I'm trying to convince you of A or to do something. This is, I really want you to inform. So a descriptive paragraph, really close sometimes to a story, but how it could be different is I could tell you a story about somebody in the concentration camp, or I could describe what it's like in the camp. And it's a slight difference, but it is different. So what do you need to describe, right? Not necessarily tell a story. right? And sometimes you need to describe a situation before you can even then tell the story, right? Because your audience might not know what's going on, right? When you're doing description, right, you want to think about people. We have a lot of senses. So sure, tell us what it looks like, but don't forget what it feels like, what it smells like, etc. If that fits, right? And then so again, I wouldn't right now worry about this one, the persuasive, right? But as far as the definition, write down any terms you think you need to define. As far as description here, talk about, okay, what's something that it would really help if my audience gets a description of this? Because remember, while everybody in the class read the book that you read, probably very few people have read the research that you've done. So you're going to be bringing in new information, which is great. And sometimes you might have to give us a description of what was going on in that other place, right? And expository, you can think about, I think that exploratory or explaining, this is where you get to come in and say, okay, I told you this story, I gave you this comparison, here's why, or here's what I'm thinking about it, right? So whenever you're explaining your thinking, this can be considered an expository paragraph, right? Or expository writing. So as far as examples go, think about what do you need to explain, or what's going on in your head that needs to show up in the paper. Right? Hopefully this helps. I do not expect you will use all 7 types of these paragraphs in your paper. I'm betting you're going to use at least 4, right? And they'll be some of them will be totally blended together and will work great. But print out this handout, right, and see how much you can fill up just thinking through what you've already read, your own thoughts. Then once you've got that bigger list, circle the most interesting things that seem to be connected together and write that out, and you'll have your first draft. That's it. Hope this helps.